All right, everybody. I'm going to take you guys along for the ride on a sheath build from start to finish. And it's a longer video than what I normally would do, but I think it would be really beneficial to other knife makers that maybe are just now learning or just wanting to learn how to do a sheath, or at least finding it interesting to see how and which I do mine. So anyway, it's going to be a detailed dive into how I make my knife sheaths. You can see the knife that I'm making the sheath for right there in the lower left corner, that cherry burl epoxy hybrid. And what I've already done thus far in the video is I have used my template for the sheath profile that fits that knife shape. And this is a template that I've used many times. I save all the knife templates since I've done so many. I have templates now for pretty much every size of knife, every shape of knife that I've ever built. So when I do repeat designs, it's easy because I already have the template made. So anyway, I've laid that template out. Be sure and pay attention to whether or not it is going to be carried on the right side of the body or the left side. That would be important to know as far as which way you put the smooth side of the leather. For a right hand, the smooth side, the belt loop would be on the right side. So I've got that cut out. I'm now marking a center line so that I know exactly when I fold this sheath where center is. And that tool right there, you'll have to forgive me, I don't really know what its proper name is, but that tool is going to groove that center line out, makes that fold a lot better. It kind of creates room for that leather to fold nicely, and it just makes a big difference on how the presentation at the end, how that sheath looks. A lot more flat and less round. So it gives better retention too in the end. So since my template is not perfect, my cutting skills are not perfect. You see me cleaning up the edges there on a belt sander. And now I'm going to draw my welt line. So I'm going to lay the knife in there, making sure that I leave that slight gap along the spine to my groove that I've cut. You want to leave a gap there so that when you fold it over, it doesn't become too tight. So depending on the thickness of the blade, you want to make that gap the appropriate size. And there you can see the line that I've drawn for my welt. I am now cutting the welt out of just a random scrap piece of leather that I have, which I end up with a ton of scraps. So I try and use them up as best I can. And the welt is very, very important. The purpose of the welt is so that when you use the sheath with a sharpened knife, you don't cut your stitches. So it's an extra piece of material that protects your stitching from the cutting edge. That is its purpose. So the welt needs to be thick enough to where there's kind of an appropriate amount of space on either side of the stitching. You make it too narrow, too thin, too thick, just kind of the wrong sized piece of material, the stitching can get too close to one side or too close to the other and end up over time, as it gets kind of worn down, be at risk for being cut. That tool there is a beveling tool, an edge beveler. And I'm just removing a tiny bit of material off of the corners. When when you go to finish it at the end, beveling those corners off can help tremendously in the overall look. I'm also very intentionally not beveling the areas that meet up when it's folded. If you bevel those when they meet up for the welt, it just doesn't look right. You gotta wait and leave those edges alone. So I'm only beveling the top edges and the loop itself. And this is what we call casing the leather. Getting it damp. Go over it however many times necessary to allow that leather to absorb moisture without becoming completely saturated. So it's absorbing moisture from the sponge, and you can notice as a few minutes go by the color changing. As I applied the moisture, it got very dark, and it's gradually lightening back to its original color. Once it gets back to its original color, it's ready to tool. If you tool too soon while it's still dark and too wet, the tooling ends up kind of, as that leather dries out, it kind of loses its crisp edges. So you gotta wait a few minutes before you tool. You want that leather to return more closely to its original color. I have laid out my roadmap, so to speak, of the border. Now I am using a swivel knife. Sorry, losing my train of thought. Using a swivel knife here to actually cut that border into the leather. And it is guardrails for the entire edge of the tooling, kind of that stop, if you will, to where it makes it easier to control where that tooling starts and stops. So here what you're seeing is a stamp that I will use. It is a white-tailed deer. And I do this first because it is kind of the focal point of the entire sheath. And I'd like to know exactly where that's going to be. And I'm going to tool everything else around that. When everybody looks at this sheath at the end of the process, it is going to be the first thing that they see. So it goes on first. And then from there, I can begin the rest of the tooling process. So for this piece, I'm beveling the inside edge of my swivel knife line there that I started with. I'm beveling the inside so that the background of the deer is lower. I want that deer to be kind of raised up above everything else. So if it was the opposite, knowing what side of the line to bevel can be, a decision that you make. If you were going to texture the border and leave the kind of background of that deer high, you would bevel the other side, and your border would be textured down low and give you the depth. Since I'm texturing the background of the deer, I'm beveling on the inside of that line to make the main body of that sheath lower than the edge. So beveling is kind of tricky. The moisture content of the leather has to be just right. The angle in which you hold the tool needs to be just right. The force in which you apply, the strike of your hammer, maul, mallet, whatever you want to call it, has to be very consistent. And it takes a lot of practice. I mean, if you go back through on my Facebook page or Instagram and you see kind of the beginnings of where my tooling started to where it's going now, beveling I've shown, huge amount of improvement in the beveling. Just how smooth it is, how subtle it is, how nice it looks, and it's not so choppy and inconsistent. And that's the thing that you fight when you haven't quite got the feel for it, is you fight the individual tool impressions. where you get a bevel imprint, and then you move it over a little and you get another bevel imprint. And it doesn't look consistent along the whole piece to where it's just one big smooth bevel and not individual little strikes of each impression. So I beveled the inside of my line all the way around, and now I'm beveling around the whitetail stamp. And this can be tricky just because it's so tiny and so technical. And so it's just one of those things you got to be really patient and really mindful of exactly where you're putting pressure. I mean, the leather's really soft, and I'm using some really small tools here, about this, tiny little pear-shaped beveler, a little tiny steep angled beveler, to try and control where I'm beveling. But it's hard. The tools are just, you can only get them so small. And the little spots and turns and angles and little pieces around this stamp, just the tools don't fit well in these little tiny corners and stuff. And so you got to be really, really careful, because if you mess up that stamp, it's hard to come back from. So you err on the side of caution and work your way up to the edge, and don't get too aggressive. Be patient, take your time, and just go for it a little bit at a time. You can see here I'm just barely tapping that tool with that mallet. It doesn't take much when you're using these little tiny tools. You hit too hard and you can really make way too deep of an impression than you meant. So I'm just barely tapping it. I'm going to speed this up just a tiny bit here. That right there is a modeling spoon, and it's got a leaf-shaped point to it. I'm just trying to kind of clean up those last little corners and clean up those bevels just a little bit to smooth things out. Leather was starting to dry out a little bit, so I get a little more moisture before I start tooling the main body of the sheath. I give some moisture in there. This is me thinking about, what am I going to do? Am I going to do a tri-weave, basket weave, foliage texture? Hadn't quite decided it until now. I usually don't plan these things out all that well in advance. It just kind of happens in the moment. But I end up at the end of the day deciding on a basket weave. And that line that you saw me draw, very lightly draw that line. I want that line to fade away in the end so that nobody can see it. So I'm just barely scribing a line that's just a reference point for me to start. Everything that I do from here on with that basket weave, stems from that line. And I'm alternating on either side of that line to give me my starting point for the whole thing. Basket weave is a really, really fun tooling to do. It's all about symmetry and consistency. At the end of the day, the way that God made our eyeballs is we can spot an inconsistency in a pattern really, really well. I mean, think of a word search or any kind of, find it type of game that you may play with your kids. These patterns that are laid out, and you're supposed to spot this, find the spot that's wrong. And it's just incredible how quickly our eyes can jump to that spot and say, yep, that one doesn't belong. That one's different than all the rest. And that's essentially what we're trying to avoid when it comes to doing a pattern like this. We want to make them look exactly the same. And so it's something that you got to go slow, be patient, take your time, and do it right. you can see, I mean, this is sped up 2.5 times. This isn't real time. And you can see that every time I place that tool, I pause before I strike. I want to make sure that tool is sitting exactly where I want it to sit before I hit it. Because once I hit it, there's no going back. If I mess up one piece on this, I mean, it's on there. If you screw the pattern up, rarely is there a way to recover from that. So you gotta be intentional about every single time that you hit that tool, that it's right in the exact same spot, or right in the spot that you want it to be. As I get to the areas in which I don't want to put the pattern, around that white-tailed deer or in the spot where I'm going to put my maker's mark, I have to start thinking through, okay, how's this going to look right when I go around something? And so you'll see me pause numerous times in this process to think about, okay, where's this going? What's it going to look like? Kind of envisioning that pattern before I lay it down to make sure that I don't misplace a mark. For whatever reason, when I was doing this, I just got to this point in which I couldn't get my brain wrapped around how that pattern was going to look. It just, the way that deer stamp and the where that I wanted my maker's mark to go, I just couldn't quite figure out how I wanted that to stop, or where I kind of faded that pattern out. And anyway, I just was having trouble trying to figure out where I wanted things to go. So I get real, hesitant. Like I had said before, the second I put one of those marks down, it's there. So you don't want to just go willy-nilly just slamming them in there, because it just can ruin it in the end. So you can see me getting really cautious around that corner. That's kind of right there in that focal point for the entire project. That's where everybody's eye is going to land when they're looking at this thing, when this knife is worn on the belt. So I was really hesitant, and at the end of the day, I just stopped and went back to the main body and kept going where I knew I needed to tool, and left that corner alone. I thought, if I need to make any adjustments, I'll come back to it later, and just proceeded on with the rest of it. So you can see that's exactly what I'm doing now. When you get up to the edge there, where we had beveled prior, you can see I'll angle the tool away from the edge. I'll make half of an impression, or however much of the impression I need to kind of gradually fade that all the way to the edge. You can kind of play with that at your discretion, as far as stop where you stop and where you choose to continue on. But it takes a lot of touch, a lot of control to kind of put half of a mark in instead of the whole thing. So practice that a few times before you start in on a project, and just get a feel for at what angle you need to hold that tool to leave the mark that you want to leave. That way you don't accidentally cross a line and potentially have a flaw that somebody's eye jumps to first. One thing that jumps out at you with this is, if you remember back when we started, that center line on the back side where it folds, we took material away. And so now when we're on the skin side and we're tooling, that thin spot, you can see some of those marks kind of fall right on that line that we grooved on the back side. And it looks kind of funny right now, but when we fold it, you'll never know, because they'll be right on the fold. So yeah, you can see that imperfection now when it's flat, but wait till we fold it and those will never be an issue. This is a camouflage tool, and it is a beveled tool. So the camouflage impression is it sits at an angle where you get a really deep impression right along our the line that we cut with the swivel knife, and it kind of gradually tapers towards the end of that kind of seashell shaped piece. And it is designed specifically for this purpose, to kind of blend where your pattern stops and where your border is. It just kind of fades everything together. It's a transition area, and it ends up looking really nice. The one thing that you got to be careful about is the corners. You know, when you're working on these patterns, you want the corners to match. You want where you start and where you stop to be priority. The spacing between each impression is important, but it's less important than where you start and where you stop. Those corners need to be identical. You can kind of play with the spacing in between in order to get the right start point and stop point. So that's why I didn't start in one corner and go all the way around the entire thing like a snake. You saw me jump from one corner to the other corner and do my priority spots and then fill in the difference. I did it in that order for a reason. Here is the dye that I'll be using. It is a EcoFlow Antique Gel, which is new for me, been playing with, and I really like it. Adds a ton of depth to the tooling. Basically, the reason why is the deeper parts where the tooling are end up being darker, and the area on the surface, your high spots, end up being lighter. So it gives a lot of depth, whereas a traditional dye, all of it's, for the most part, consistent. It's all the same color. So it can look a little more flat. Whereas this stuff here just brings out another level of depth that you otherwise wouldn't accomplish. That's also why I'm using that shop rag there, because I want to remove the amount of dye on the high spots. So I'm keeping my hand pretty flat, and I'm removing the gel from the high spots, the flat spots, and it leaves behind more gel in the valleys, the low spots. This here's just a regular brush to kind of get into some of the really deep spots that didn't get hit. I use the tips of that brush to make sure that I don't have any spots that are undyed. Of course, my big old head's in the way. I had this camera over my shoulder. I wasn't really paying attention to where it was and where I was, and so it's kind of in the way there, but you guys get the idea. What I'm doing here is, you can't really tell, but the tips of the antlers kind of got washed out. And they weren't holding the same look as the lower 2/3 of that stamp. I just wanted it to be more of a darker outline all the way around, to where those tips of those antlers jumped out a little bit better. So you got to be super careful to get that stamp lined up exactly, and I mean exactly, the way that it was the first time that I put the impression on. And so I got it all lined up, and angled pressure towards the tines of those antlers and gave it a couple strikes to give a little more depth to those antlers. And then the dye held a better profile. I'm marking out where this is going to go because I don't want to dye the areas that I'm going to glue. I have seen other makers do this differently, but for me, what I have found is that if I dyed this whole thing, the glue just does not want to stick. So I find it best to omit the areas that are going to be glued. I don't put any dye on them. So I've marked out the welt on both sides. I've marked out this loop to where when I glue this up, there is no dye where I am going to have the glue. And that right there you saw me do, putting dye on the inside edge of that welt, is super important to remember. After you get that welt glued up and everything's folded up and nice and tight, it is so hard to get that little piece dyed. You got to use that little tiny brush and wiggle some dye in there, and it's hard to access once you fold it. So it's better to do it prior to, and it's easy to forget. And then doing the edges there, edges of the loop, they're easier to do now than later. And I will slick those. I'll burnish those edges again at the end. But again, it's a lot easier to do it now than after it's folded. So I'll give it a little head start prior to folding it over. This is the glue that I'm using is an Elmer's rubber cement. There are much fancier glues out there that most people are using. I do not like them. I've consistently struggled with those glues requiring thinner, and I don't use enough of it to use it up before it goes bad. And it's like $15 for a little tiny jar, and I end up throwing half of it away because it's dried up. Rubber cement, this cheap Walmart Elmer's rubber cement, works really well, and it's like $3. So I can't figure out a good enough reason to switch from it because I like it better and it's cheaper. One of the biggest tricks to this that I have found is to apply multiple coats of glue. Put on the coat, let it dry, or at least get tacky, then add a second coat, then let it dry enough to get tacky, then fold. One coat, it just doesn't stick well. It takes 2 coats to get a really good bond. When you're gluing rough side of the leather to rough side, you don't have to really prep it at all. When you're doing smooth side, you want to use it. You want to rough it up, get some texture on that smooth side. Helps with adhesion. And a few moments ago, you saw me do that on the welt. I used I don't even know what it's called. But as a little tool that scratches that smooth side of the leather, roughs it up to get a better bond. So I'm getting my holes punched right there, and I want to be mindful of keeping those holes located inside the tooled area. I don't want to accidentally get that hole onto my border, my smooth leather border. You want to keep those holes punched in where the tooling is. It just looks a lot cleaner. And right there, I'm using the stitching groover to groove those to where that stitching is going to lay recessed slightly into that leather. The reason being is you don't want those stitches to be raised, and when you go to sheath the knife, the point of the blade to catch one of those stitches. So you want to be sure and remember to groove those. That way the stitches are recessed past flush, and it protects them long term. So for all the stitching that I do a saddle stitch, and that works really well for me. It's really strong. It's pretty easy to do, and that's just the only way that I've done it. So saddle stitch works for me, and if it isn't broke, why fix it? This here is artificial sinew, is what I stitch with 9 times out of 10. It really is fitting for the style of sheaths that I make. Occasionally I'll use a white or a black, but I really like the artificial sinew. And I backstitch a hole, sometimes several holes, to finish it out. And then there you see me trimming off the excess. I'll trim it just slightly long and then burn it down. You don't want to cut it too close and not have enough material to burn. And if you cut it too long, you just get a big burn end, which is okay for security and strength, but it can look a little off. So find what works for you, but about a 1/8 of an inch is plenty long enough to burn down and smash it flat so it looks nice. Getting my 2 coats of rubber cement applied on the welt, so that when I get this folded over, I get a nice strong bond with the glue. Try and keep the application nice and even, and be sure and give it plenty of time to get tacky. If you fold it too soon, it doesn't want to hold. If you wait too long, it doesn't want to hold. So there's kind of a middle ground there where it gets nice and tacky, and that's the best time to fold. You can speed that up a little bit by moving some air across it. So I was blowing a little bit of air across there just to speed it up. But it only takes a few minutes, and it gets tacky and you're ready to fold. If possible, it is best to have the welt be just ever so slightly long. That way when you sand it back, it is nice and flush. If the welt ends up being a tiny bit short, that's no big deal, but when you sand it back, you end up taking some material away from your border. And if you have to take too much away, then the width of your border can change along the edge there, and you want to try and keep it all nice and consistent so that it looks nice and pretty. So keeping the welt a little bit long and trimming that back to the sheath is easier than trimming the sheath back to the welt, if that makes sense. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm getting that all nice and flush, nice and cleaned up on the belt. And you can see there, nice and clean, using the edge beveler to bevel the edges of the welt. And that's exactly the reason why we didn't bevel those edges at the very beginning. If you bevel those edges, on the inside edges in particular, it doesn't look right when they marry up after the fold, and then you end up just doing it again later. So beveling the welt is best to wait till the end. Dyeing those edges, I will burnish those edges momentarily and get that welt looking as pretty as I can before we do the final stitch. I always butcher the name of that stuff, but trigga something, triggagum. I don't even remember, but it is a burnishing agent. Gum trigacanth. I don't remember. EcoFlow makes it, and it works pretty well for slicking those edges. Just dab it on there with your finger and slick it with the burnishing tool. Get everything all nice and pretty. Only a couple steps left. Can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel now. The sheath's coming together pretty nice. Just a scrap piece of oak I have that kind of saves the tips of my tools there from getting tore up. Punching through 3 layers of material is somewhat challenging. You'd end up having to hit those pretty hard, and you don't want to hit those into the that's a piece of quartz that I tool on, but some people use granite, quartz, whatever. But yeah, the prongs on those will snap or dull pretty quick if you were beating them into that quartz. So a scrap piece of wood does the trick for protecting those. And I have had great luck with just the 2 pieces, a 4-prong and a 2-prong. These are the only 2 that I need for knife sheaths. I have yet to find a sheath that I can't do with these 2. I used to do a combination of marking these out and using the drill press, but in time I just stopped using the drill press because I didn't like the way that it rounded out those holes. You know, these are a diamond shaped prong, and it makes that stitch dance just ever so slightly along the way because of the diamond shape hole that it leaves. When you round those out with a 16th inch drill bit, it loses that little bit of a diamond shape, and that stitch doesn't dance back and forth with just a slightest zigzag. So it's a little more work, but punching through 3 layers looks nicer than punching through 1 and then going to the drill press to finish it out. A wingspan, my wingspan from fingertip to fingertip length has been a pretty great reference for me based on the size of the knife and the length of the stitch. I know I can go just shy of a full wingspan or a little bit longer than a full wingspan. And so anyway, that wingspan of mine is kind of my reference point for how much stitching material I need. And wingspan more often than not is enough. But if ever in doubt, better to have too much than not enough. You don't want to get down to your last couple of stitches and all of a sudden you don't have enough material and you gotta cut them all out and redo it. That would be a huge pain. So make sure you get plenty of extra. And I'm doing a saddle stitch again here with that same artificial sinew I used for the belt loop. Notice that I put a couple pieces of leather in the jaws of that vise. Even though the vise is a soft jawed vise, those are a soft rubber jaw. This sheath is still kind of wet. It hasn't dried all the way from the tooling that we did and the dye that we applied, and worked really hard on making those look nice and pretty. So I don't want to mess it up now by leaving an impression from the jaws of that vise. So a couple little shims of scrap leather in there can help alleviate any concern for marring the tooled surfaces. First test fit right here. I have sharpened this off camera. I sharpened that knife up at this point. And first test fit. This actually was a little bit tighter than I intended. Normally that first fit is pretty tight, but this one was even just a smidge tighter than I had planned. Wasn't a problem. You just have to be pretty careful going in because the knife was already sharp. Most of the time when I do my first test fit, that knife's not sharp yet. But when it's already sharp and you go to force that in there for the first time, you just got to be really careful you don't cut something that you didn't mean to cut. You know, go right through your welt, or, you know, have it not quite lined up right, and all of a sudden the tip of your knife's poking through the side of the sheath. That'd be a bad day. So nice and easy going in there the first time, and give it a few repetitions there to kind of wear out that space. This is a sheath I did prior, a long time ago, I don't know how long, like a month ago, just to compare the retention. That other one was perfect, and this one here is a little tight, but it'll wear in, as this leather dries, and as that knife gets used a few times, it'll wear in really nicely to where it'll be about the same as that other sheath. So it's a little snug right now at the moment, but it won't be for long. Putting some Resolene on there, some final finish. This is a waterproofing type of finish, as well as kind of a dye lock, if you will. So it keeps that dye from leaching out of the material and into your jeans. If you were to wear this out in the field and get caught in the rain, you don't want that dye to release and bleed into the fabric of whatever you're wearing. So that Resolene is a great thing for waterproofing the sheath, help it last longer, and also keeping the dye locked in so you don't lose it over time. But anyway, this sheath turned out real nice. I'm really pleased with the final outcome. And it's going to serve somebody really well as both a very functional sheath and a very pretty one at the same time. So I'm really happy with it. Thanks for joining me along the ride here. I am by no means an expert. I'm still learning something new every day. But I'm really enjoying the leatherworking in particular as a part of my knife making process. It's one that I look forward to the most, is the leather work. It's just something that's really captivated part of my creativity and craftsmanship, and so I just really enjoy it, and I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned with others to try and help them learn to love it too. So if you liked this video, I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something, and you go to put it in practice and you have questions, feel free to reach out. And if you're a more experienced leather worker and sheath maker, if you're more experienced than me and you see something that I can improve on, or a tip that you want to share with me, feel free to do that as well. I love to learn and I love to try new things. So hope you Hope you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for more in the future. Thanks.